On October 6, 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel in what became known as the October War or the Ramadan War. The attacks caught the Israelis completely by surprise. And while it only lasted 6 days, it was one of the most tactically brilliant conflicts in modern history. In this time, Egypt managed to do something that had been thought impossible for decades. They recaptured the Sinai Peninsula, which had been in Israeli hands since 1967. But how did they pull it off? How was Israel so easily caught off guard? And why does this war still matter today? The Yom Kippur War began with a surprise attack on October 6, 1973. This date happened to be both the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur and the Muslim holiday of Ramadan, which made it a particularly auspicious day for an attack. At 2 p.m., Egyptian Air Force jets took off from their air bases and headed towards the Bar Lev Line, a series of Israeli defensive fortifications along the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. Flying back and forth between the canal and the Israeli positions were Soviet-built helicopters that relayed updated information on the locations of the Egyptian columns to Israeli command. These choppers also engaged any Israeli forces that tried to stop them. By 4 p.m., the bulk of the Egyptian troops had crossed the canal and opposed. Tanks rumbled across makeshift bridges over the canal and pushed into the Sinai. While this was going on, Syrian troops were attacking Israeli positions in the Golan Heights to the north. But almost immediately, the Egyptians ran into trouble. The Bar Lev Line wasn't as deserted as they'd hoped. It contained plenty of military equipment, including tanks, artillery, anti-tank missiles, and even aircraft. The Egyptians were forced to abandon some of their vehicles and flee into the desert. Even at night, the Israeli Air Force flew combat sorties and bombed Egyptian positions near the canal. Meanwhile, elite Israeli paratrooper units landed behind enemy lines and fought their way to the Bar Lev Line, stopping the Egyptian advance. It looked like the Israelis might be able to hold off the Egyptian attack. But then two things happened. First, the Israeli government decided that no Israeli life was worth sacrificing to hold the Bar Lev Line. They ordered the defenders to retreat to the Israeli border, giving up all of the Sinai in the process. Second, the U.S. had committed itself to supporting Israel unconditionally. American air power started arriving in the region and bombing the Egyptians alongside the Israelis. With heavy losses, the Egyptians were forced to stop their advance at Aran Abu Ajala. Here, some 15 miles from the Suez Canal, the fighting settled into a stalemate. But the following day, the Egyptians attacked again. Their main goal was still the same, to capture the cities of El Arish and Rafah, which would allow them to take over the rest of the Sinai. But this time, the Egyptians had backup. On the second day of the war, the Soviet Union had declared its intention to support Egypt. Within hours of the declaration, Soviet bombers and anti-submarine warfare aircraft arrived over Egypt. For the next 4 days, they conducted airstrikes against the Israelis. The Egyptians used this opportunity to launch repeated attacks, pushing the Israelis further and further back. Finally, on October 11th, the Egyptians captured Abu Ajila and broke through the front lines. From here, they raced towards the Suez Canal, hoping to recapture it before the Israelis could blow the bridges behind them. By now, the Israelis were demoralized. Their previous confidence in their invincible army was gone. As the Egyptians approached the Suez, the Israelis blew up the bridges, stranding thousands of their soldiers on the east bank. With no other choice, these troops surrendered. 2,500 of them marched out of the city with their weapons stacked on the ground beside them. Another 7,000 were transported to the West Bank in boats. Among them was former Prime Minister Golda Meir, who famously remarked, "We are gathered here like cattle." In total, the Israelis lost 20,000 men during the war, killed, wounded or captured. The Egyptians suffered similar casualties, although estimates vary widely depending on the source. On the political front, the war resulted in the Camp David Accords, a series of peace agreements intended to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. They were negotiated between Israel and Egypt and led to the return of the Sinai in exchange for the release of Israeli POWs. The peace treaty was the first of its kind in the Arab world and opened the door for future peace negotiations. In hindsight, the Egyptian victory in the October War looks pretty clear-cut. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, there were many analysts at the time who argued that the war had been a tactical victory for the Israelis. After all, they'd stopped the Egyptian advance and inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy. So what changed our minds? Why is the October War remembered as an Egyptian victory? Well, the answer is simple: strategy. In order to win wars, you need to set achievable strategic goals. And if you accomplish those goals, you win. If not, you lose. By this measure, the Egyptians won the war because they accomplished their strategic objective, the liberation of the Sinai. But what about the Israelis? Well, their strategic objective was a bit more nebulous. They wanted to stop the Egyptian advance and inflict heavy casualties on the enemy. In theory, this is fine. But in practice, it meant that the Israelis were pursuing shifting goals. For example, first, it was the Bar-Lev line, then it was the Suez Canal, and then it was Abu Ajila. Each time they gave up ground because they felt like the price to hold on to it was too high. To be fair to the Israelis, this approach isn't uncommon. In fact, every major power has done something similar. But that doesn't make it any less stupid. Shifting goals and counterproductive strategies are never a good idea. Fortunately for the Israelis, they had the US to bail them out. But even American support came at a cost. For the duration of the war, there was a massive propaganda campaign aimed at getting the UN to impose a ceasefire. The Americans even threatened the Soviets with nuclear war unless they agreed to call off their airstrikes. So the Israelis may have technically fought better than the Egyptians during the war, but that didn't matter because they were fighting without a plan. It's a classic example of how tactics are important, but strategy is more important. If the Israelis had just come up with a coherent strategy and stuck to it, they might have won the war. But instead, they wasted lives and resources chasing down elusive tactical victories until finally the Americans and Soviets forced them to sue for peace. Although the October War began as an attack on Israel, within a week it had turned into a full-scale regional war involving the superpowers. This development raised the specter of World War III. So what was it about the war that caused it to spiral out of control? Well, the answer is simple. It was the lack of communication. As soon as the fighting started, the superpowers began passing messages back and forth. The US told the Egyptians to stop their advance and the USSR told the Israelis not to cross the Suez. This went on for 2 days with neither side backing down. Finally, on October 8th, the US sent the Egyptians an ultimatum. Either halt your offensive or face airstrikes from American aircraft. The Egyptians ignored the warning and pressed on. 2 days later, the US retaliated by bombing Egyptian positions. This marked the beginning of America's involvement in the war. Meanwhile, the Soviets were also passing messages back and forth with the Egyptians, trying to get them to agree to a ceasefire. But the Egyptians refused. Once the Americans started bombing them, though, they changed their mind. Suddenly a ceasefire seemed like a very good idea. And fortunately for them, the Israelis wouldn't agree to it. They wanted more land before calling off the fighting. This set up a standoff between the superpowers. Each side accused the other of violating international law by bombing the other side's ally. And each side threatened the other with nuclear war unless they backed off. Finally, on October 22nd, the fighting ended with a ceasefire and the superpowers breathing a sigh of relief. In hindsight, it seems obvious that a war between the superpowers would have been catastrophic. But at the time, it wasn't so clear. In fact, the President of the United States had drawn a line in the sand over the conflict and threatened war unless it ended. So what happened and why does it matter today? The answer is simple. It was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. The situation started to stabilize after the ceasefire when President Nixon phoned Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and told him that he was ready to talk. The two leaders met at a conference in Moscow and agreed to work together to end the war and reduce Cold War tensions. This set in motion the events that led to the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union. So why does this war still matter today? Well, it matters because it shows us how close we came to nuclear war. If the superpowers had gotten involved earlier or stayed involved longer, who knows what would have happened? It's a sobering thought that keeps me up at night. Now you need to watch Why We Really Don't Need the Military or click this other video instead.